The 9,707th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Hans Grunberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, and Ms. Lisa Dotten, Director, Financing and Partnerships Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grunberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in 4 days, on the 19th of August, we will commemorate World Humanitarian Day, a day dedicated to honoring those who tirelessly serve people in need around the world, including in Yemen. Yet, in Yemen, we are facing a clampdown by Ansar Allah on the humanitarian and civic space. It has been almost 80 days since Ansar Allah started its concerted campaign detaining Yemeni employees of the UN, civil society, national and international NGOs, diplomatic missions, and private sector entities. Dozens of men and women, among which 13 UN personnel, including one of my own staff members, are still being detained in unknown locations. These detentions are in addition to OHCHR and UNESCO staff who have been detained by Ansar Allah since 2021 and 2023, respectively. In addition, on the 29th of July, Ansar Allah closed the OHCHR office in Sana'a and asked its international staff to leave. Following the closure, Ansar Allah security forces, in a flagrant violation of the UN privileges and immunities, stormed the office on the 3rd of August. This is an ominous signal of the broader direction Ansar Allah is taking and represents a serious attack on the ability of the UN to perform its mandate. Protecting human rights is fundamentally about protecting the future of Yemen and the rights and freedoms of Yemenis. I therefore call on Ansar Allah to act responsibly and compassionately towards its fellow countrymen and women, and immediately and unconditionally release all UN, NGO, civil society, diplomatic mission, and private sector employees, as well as members of religious minorities, and refrain from further arbitrary detentions. Let them be reunited with their families. Let them go back to their jobs, serving Yemenis, providing humanitarian assistance, development assistance, peace building, human rights, mediation, and the protection of cultural heritage. Mr. President, the Middle East is currently holding its breath, and I sincerely hope that the escalatory trajectory that we have experienced in the past months can be reversed. What started in Israel and Gaza in October last year has drawn in several other countries, including Yemen. Despite serious efforts to shield Yemen from this regional escalation, Ansar Allah continues to attack ships in the Red Sea, and the US and the UK have continued their strikes on military targets in Ansar Allah-controlled territory. This situation, which has lasted for over 8 months now, is not sustainable. Mr. President, this regional escalation is taking place in parallel to real and urgent challenges inside Yemen that need to be addressed. Addressing the decade-long conflict in Yemen continues to be at the center of my work. It is a conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, has weakened Yemen's social fabric, and has undermined the delivery of public services. This has made Yemen more vulnerable to natural disasters and environmental hazards and diseases, as the recent floodings in Hodeidah, Marib, and Taiz, in addition to the continuing cholera outbreak, have demonstrated. Therefore, I once again call on the Yemeni parties, and Ansar Allah in particular, to prioritize the Yemenis. Your responsibility lies first and foremost with Yemen. We need to shift the focus back to Yemen and find solutions for Yemen's problems. Mr. President, over the past months, I have continuously expressed my deep concern about the trajectory of events in Yemen. Unfortunately, this regressive trend, illustrated by continuing military activities and escalatory rhetoric, has continued. While levels of violence along the front lines remain relatively contained compared to the period before the 2022 truce, we are continuing to witness military preparations and reinforcements accompanied by continuous threats of a return to war, with further reports of clashes in Al-Dale, Al-Hodeidah, Lahej, Marib, Sada, and Taiz. Once again, this serves as a stark reminder of how volatile the situation is along the Yemeni front lines. Mr. President, despite this bleak picture, last month, with the support of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the parties were able to halt a dangerous cycle of escalation that was negatively impacting Yemen's banking and transport sectors and threatened to ignite renewed military conflict. Since the announcement of the de-escalation understanding, which includes the functioning of Yemeniya Airlines and ensuring the continued access of Yemen's biggest banks to international banking services, we have seen some initial progress towards its implementation. However, the onus is now on the parties to not only act in good faith and fully implement the commitments they made, but also to transform the understanding into something that improves the lives and the livelihoods of all Yemenis. And with this, I again underscore the importance of working toward the unification of the currency, a unified central bank, and ensuring the banking sector is free from political interference. My office has prepared options and offered a clear proposal and pathway to achieve these objectives, all of which have been based on the input of the parties themselves. We continue to stand ready to support the parties to reach mutually acceptable solutions through dialogue for the benefit of all Yemenis. Mr. President, in December of last year, the parties agreed to a set of commitments. These commitments remain valid today, and despite the ever more complicated mediation space, I remain determined to keep all channels of communication open and to continue with our engagement at different levels on different issues. On the economy, on a nationwide ceasefire and other security arrangements, on a political process, and on the release of conflict-related detainees. In line with these efforts, last month, in partnership with UN Women, my office brought together 70 representatives of different segments of Yemeni society for its fourth consultation in Mukalla, Hadramaut, to continue the work to develop a vision for inclusive peace, elevating the voice of women. My office also visited Riyadh and Aden to continue engagements on a nationwide ceasefire and other security arrangements, including exploring ways to support de-escalation efforts in Yemen. In addition, since the conclusion of the meeting on conflict-related detainees in July, we have continued our engagements with the parties to build on the progress reached in Oman. Mr. President, we do all of this in order to keep the focus on the longer-term priorities of seeking a sustainable and just solution for the benefit of all Yemenis. I remain determined to achieve the task entrusted to me by this Council, to support the resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition. I continue to depend on the Council's full support for these efforts. Your consistent and unified messaging on the importance of a political process and a ceasefire, as well as your continued advocacy for the release of UN personnel, is all the more crucial during these turbulent times. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Doughton.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Special Envoy Grunberg for his update and for his unstinting efforts to bring about lasting peace in Yemen. Mr. President, let me start by again raising the continuing arbitrary detention by the Houthi de facto authorities of the United Nations personnel and dozens of international and national NGO staff and civil society representatives, among others. All of them are Yemeni men and women. They have now been held in detention for more than 2 months, in addition to the 4 United Nations personnel arbitrarily detained since 2021 and 2023. The United Nations continues efforts to secure their release, and we are in frequent contact with the Houthi de facto authorities and others toward this end. While a few families of the detained have been able to contact them, the vast majority have still not been afforded this opportunity. And it remains the case that neither United Nations nor legal representatives have been allowed to visit or communicate with the detained. This situation is completely unacceptable. I once again demand that the Houthi de facto authorities immediately release all of our colleagues held in detention. And I reiterate that while they are detained, they must be treated humanely and be allowed contact with family members and legal counsel in accordance with international norms. We will continue efforts to secure their release with determination until they are all freed. We urge all member states to exert any influence and leverage they have in support of these efforts. Mr. President, over recent weeks, we've seen a worrying deterioration in the operational environment in Houthi-controlled areas. The Houthi de facto authorities' recent closure of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sana'a and the subsequent forced entry of the office compound and taking control of UN assets are wholly unacceptable. I join High Commissioner Turk in urging them to leave the premises immediately and return all equipment and assets. These events have occurred alongside other worrying measures that are negatively impacting our ability to sustain humanitarian operations. The environment in these areas is growing more constrained at a time when humanitarians are already struggling to meet the needs of millions of people across the country. The United Nations and our humanitarian partners are committed to staying and delivering for the people of Yemen, but minimum requirements must be met to ensure that UN personnel and other humanitarian workers can do so without having to compromise their safety and security. Mr. President, over the past 10 days, heavy rainfall and flash flooding hit several governorates in Yemen, damaging homes, farms, and public infrastructure. About 69,500 families have been directly affected, with many losing their homes and sources of livelihood. Some 98 people have been killed and more than 600 others injured. In response, humanitarian partners have provided immediate life-saving assistance, including food, water, hygiene kits, and shelter support to affected families. They also delivered critical medical supplies to local hospitals and health centers and deployed dozens of mobile health teams to affected areas. However, a lack of adequate funding continues to undermine these and other efforts to address the critical needs across Yemen. 8 months into the year, our targeted and prioritized humanitarian response plan for 2024 is only 27% funded, forcing humanitarians to make difficult decisions about which vulnerable families and communities would receive support. Mr. President, preventing the spread of cholera is one area in which additional funds are urgently needed. Although the UN-led multi-agency cholera response plan is currently 60% funded, this was based on an initial estimate of 60,000 cholera cases between April and September 2024. Regrettably, at the beginning of this month, the number of suspected cases across the country has swelled to more than 147,000, a substantial increase from that initial estimate. This means current funding is only sufficient to address a quarter of these cases, leaving a significant response gap, which our humanitarian partners have been struggling to fill. They've been doing their best to support treatment centers, providing them with medications, medical equipment, infection control supplies, and other resources. They're working to strengthen surveillance and response mechanisms to identify and address new cases quickly. And they've also been promoting prevention measures by improving access to safe water and sanitation services, distributing hygiene kits, and raising awareness in communities at risk. However, our health cluster colleagues warn that unless these response efforts are immediately bolstered, the number of suspected cases could further increase, potentially reaching more than 250,000 in just a few weeks. Additional funding is urgently needed to prevent this. Mr. President, food security in Yemen also continues to deteriorate. Inadequate food consumption has steadily increased, now affecting 60% of surveyed households nationwide. Vulnerable groups, in particular, women-headed households, report the most significant impact. Rates of severe food deprivation in areas controlled by the Houthi de facto authorities have more than doubled from 17% to 36% compared with the same time last year. They've also increased sharply in government-controlled areas and now stand at 32%. The impacts of increasing food insecurity and malnutrition extend far beyond hunger. They also expose children, especially girls, to increased rates of abuse and neglect. Today, an alarming 30% of girls in Yemen are forced into marriage before the age of 18, as families struggle to provide for them. And the number of children out of school, currently at a staggering 4.5 million, is likely to rise as more children are forced to leave school to help provide for their families. As we know, particularly for adolescent girls, this is not only jeopardizing their futures, but exposes them to greater risks of gender-based violence. To counter the impacts of the recent pause in general food distributions in Houthi-controlled areas, the World Food Programme is currently planning a one-off food distribution to more than 1.6 million people in the 34 worst affected districts. However, as the overall situation of food insecurity continues to deteriorate across the country, enhanced action will be needed to avert a further potential catastrophe. Full and urgent funding of the humanitarian response plan for Yemen is a minimum requirement for these and other critical humanitarian needs. Mr. President, the people of Yemen cannot afford the devastating toll of further conflict. Indeed, their ability to recover from the devastation of the conflict, address increasing humanitarian needs, and take concrete steps toward a more promising and stable future all depend on locking in progress on peace. I therefore echo the Secretary General's call for restraint and de-escalation, and I urge the Council to support peace in Yemen and the region. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Doughton, for your briefings and for the tireless work of your staff and other UN personnel in Yemen. President, the situation in Yemen is desperate, with devastating flooding coming on top of an already dire humanitarian crisis. And we express condolences to all those affected by the floods. The prospect of regional escalation threatens to further undermine security and stability. We urge all parties to de-escalate to avoid deepening the humanitarian crisis. The UK condemns the Houthis' reckless and escalatory attacks across the region in conjunction with other Iranian-linked groups. We also reiterate our call on the Houthis to cease their attacks in the Red Sea, which threaten international shipping. Recent reports have shown Houthi links to al-Shabaab. We firmly condemn these actions as part of a wider pattern of Houthi destabilizing activity beyond Yemen's borders. The relevant UN sanctions committees must coordinate closely to monitor and counter this worrying trend. President, the UK condemns the Houthis' closure of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sana'a. The OHCHR presence is critical for the protection of civilians and reporting of human rights abuses. As we've heard, this follows the detention of UN, NGO and former diplomatic mission staff in June, and is yet another blatant aggression which will severely impede the delivery of vital aid to those most in need. These acts demonstrate once again the willingness of Houthi leaders to inflict harm and suffering on the Yemeni people to advance their own ambitions. It is the duty of this Council to ensure the Houthis guarantee a safe and unimpeded operational environment for humanitarian organisations. And we call on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release the detainees, leave the OHCHR premises, and return the assets they have seized. Finally, President, the Yemeni people deserve peace. Further escalation will only move us further away from achieving this. We urge restraint from all parties to preserve space for negotiations in line with the UN roadmap. And we call on this Council to remain unified in support of the Special Envoy's efforts to secure an inclusive and sustainable peace in Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Признательный спецпосланнику генсекретаря по Йемену господину Хансу Грунбергу, а также директору отдела финансирования гуманитарной деятельности и мобилизации ресурсов УКГВ ООН госпоже Лизе Доутон за доклады. Ситуация в этой ближневосточной стране остается крайне непростой. Йеменское урегулирование уже более полугода балансирует на грани жизни и смерти. Несмотря на отсутствие масштабных боевых действий, неспокойно на линии соприкосновения. Локальные стычки происходят практически каждый день. Очевидно, что терпение сторон конфликта может иссякнуть в любой момент. В нынешних условиях даже крошечная искра может спровоцировать пожар, который будет крайне сложно потушить. Деградирующая региональная обстановка подтверждает острую необходимость как можно более срочного выхода на договоренности и закрытия йеменского досье. Иначе все усилия как самих йеменских сторон, так и международных и региональных посредников с апреля прошлого года будут сведены на нет. На этом фоне любые, даже незначительные шаги йеменских протагонистов навстречу друг другу приобретают особое значение. С удовлетворением отмечаем достигнутую между йеменскими сторонами договоренность о мерах по деэскалации в финансово-экономической сфере, а также возобновлении коммерческого авиасообщения с САНой. Приветствуем роль, которую сыграли в этом процессе страны региона. При этом оснований для беспокойства ситуация в Йемене дает более чем достаточно. Так, мы встревожены сообщениями о захвате 3 августа представителями Ансар-Аллах странового офиса Управления Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека в САНе, конфискации части документов и транспортных средств. До сих пор не разрешилась ситуация с задержанными ранее 13 принятыми на месте сотрудниками ООН. Призываем как минимум обеспечить к ним немедленный гумдоступ. Действия, которые нарушают привилегии и иммунитеты структуры сотрудников Всемирной организации, недопустимы не только в Йемене, но и в любой другой стране. У Совета Безопасности ООН здесь не должно быть двойных стандартов. В этом контексте нельзя не напомнить о более 200 погибших в Газе сотрудников БАПОР и десятках разрушенных объектах агентства, а также тревожная информация о произвольных задержаниях бапоровцев израильскими силовыми структурами, применении к ним насилия и пыток. Рассчитываем, что те, кто сегодня критикует действия хуситов, будут также принципиальны и применительны к действиям Израиля. Господин председатель, с сожалением приходится констатировать неуклонно ухудшающуюся гуманитарную обстановку, а также продовольственные и энергетические кризисы в Йемене. 2/3 его населения, более 18 миллионов человек, требуется гумсодействие. Миллионы по-прежнему страдают от нехватки продовольствия. Гумплан ООН по Йемену на текущий год не профинансирован даже на четверть. Вдобавок ко всему, на эту многострадальную ближневосточную страну обрушились проливные дожди, вызвавшие разрушительные наводнения. Больше всего пострадали провинции Ходейда, Таиз и Мариб. Погибло как минимум 57 человек. Десятки тысяч семей вынуждены были покинуть места своего обитания. Окончательный ущерб еще только предстоит оценить. Как представляется, в нынешних условиях членам Совета и всему международному сообществу следует мобилизовать все доступные ресурсы для помощи простым йеменцам, борющимся за свою жизнь. Они должны иметь беспрепятственный доступ к еде, лекарствам и другим необходимым вещам, вне зависимости от географии проживания. Исходим из того, что единственным путем для достижения широкого национального согласия и выработки совместного видения будущего страны является запуск инклюзивного межйеменского диалога под эгидой ООН. Неизменно поддерживаем усилия спецпосланника Ханса Грюнберга, в том числе нацеленные на формальное закрепление устойчивого режима прекращения огня и запуск полноформатного инклюзивного национального диалога при поддержке ООН. Со своей стороны продолжаем координировать подходы со всеми ведущими политсилами в Йемене, а также региональными партнерами. Конечная цель – выход на долгосрочную стабилизацию. Вновь напоминаем о необходимости обновления международно-правовых основ урегулирования в Йемене. Господин председатель, думаю, мало кто сегодня решится отрицать, что общее неуклонное нарастание эскалации на Ближнем Востоке самым непосредственным образом сказывается на обстановке в Йемене. Страна, к сожалению, все больше вовлекается в региональную турбулентность. Нападения на коммерческие суда в Красном море по-прежнему представляют серьезную проблему. Призываем хуситов прекратить любые действия, препятствующие свободе международного судоходства, а также освободить судно Galaxy Leader и его экипаж. Одновременно требуем от всех международных игроков уважать суверенитет Йемена. Агрессивные действия в отношении объектов на территории этой страны, вроде ударов западной так называемой коалиции из акватории Красного моря, не просто грубо нарушают международное право, включая устав ООН, но и способствуют раскручиванию спирали эскалации с самыми непредсказуемыми последствиями. При этом очевидно, что действия Ансар Аллах не предпринимаются в вакууме, а отражают степень накопленного в регионе раздражения политика Израиля, в буквальном смысле пытающегося сравнять сектор Газа с землей, подвергая серьезнейшей угрозе жизни почти 2 миллионов его обитателей. И бездействие Совета Безопасности ООН лишь способствует подогреванию подобного настроя у арабской улицы, поддерживающей принципиальную линию хуситов. Июльское обострение в результате обмена ударами между ними и Израилем в очередной раз продемонстрировало, что нормализация как в ближневосточном регионе, так и в районе Красного моря невозможна без деэскалации в Газе. А она не может произойти без немедленного полноценного прекращения огня, добиться которого Совет Безопасности ООН не может вот уже 10 месяцев из-за произраильской линии Вашингтона. Коллеги, разорвать этот порочный круг могут только коллективные решительные действия, которые вернули бы ближневосточное урегулирование под эгиду ООН и в русло общеизвестной договорно-правовой базы, заданной решениями Совета Безопасности ООН. Все остальные мутные схемы, выгодные отдельным игрокам, но не дающие палестинцам то, что им давно положено по праву, лишь отдаляют нас от достижения устойчивого и справедливого мира в регионе. Давайте сосредоточимся, наконец, на этой неотложной задаче, решение которой значительно облегчит наши усилия по урегулированию других конфликтов, в том числе йеменского. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'envoyé spécial Hans Grunberg et Mme Lisa Doughton de OCHA pour leurs interventions. La guerre est laide, c'est par ces mots qu'Elham Hassan, 40 ans, habitante de Sanaa, commence sa lettre de septembre 2023 aux générations futures, un saisissant plaidoyer pour la paix. Elle ajoute, même lorsque les combats prennent fin, les choses ne redeviennent pas comme avant. Vous êtes peut-être encore en vie et vous respirez, mais vous ne vivez plus vraiment. Ces mots nous rappellent notre devoir, éviter les conflits et leurs lourdes conséquences. À ce titre, 3 points doivent être soulevés. Premièrement, il est urgent de mettre fin à la spirale de la violence. La Suisse reste très préoccupée par la situation dans la région, y compris au Yémen. Il faut éviter une escalade régionale encore plus grave. Celle-ci aurait aussi pour conséquence une aggravation de la situation au Yémen avec un coût humain désastreux. Nous appelons toutes les parties au strict respect du droit international, y inclus des droits et des libertés de navigation en mer Rouge. Nous réitérons notre appel à la plus grande retenue et à une solution diplomatique. La Suisse soutient tous les efforts diplomatiques actuellement en cours à cet égard. Deuxièmement, la résolution du conflit politique au Yémen doit rester au centre de notre attention. Nous appelons toutes les parties à tout faire pour éviter le retour d'un conflit à grande échelle. Favoriser toute mesure de renforcement de la confiance est primordial. Le mois dernier, nous avions salué l'accord concernant la cessation des mesures de rétorsion dans le secteur bancaire et la reprise de certains vols commerciaux. sa mise en œuvre partielle est un pas dans la bonne direction. Toute mesure de rétorsion économique doit cesser. La Suisse appelle les parties au conflit à respecter les dispositions de l'accord de désescalade économique et à se réunir sur l'égide de l'Office de l'envoyé spécial. La reprise des discussions concernant un échange de prisonniers en juin dernier est un signal positif que nous saluons. Ces discussions représentent une opportunité pour créer un climat de confiance et redonner un élan aux pourparlers entamés par l'envoyé spécial. Dans ce contexte, la Suisse réitère son plein soutien au rôle de médiation de l'envoyé spécial. Troisièmement, seul un soutien au travail humanitaire et une résolution du conflit par la voie diplomatique permettront une amélioration pérenne de la situation humanitaire alarmante. Nous sommes préoccupés par les inondations soudaines. Une étude réalisée par une ONG yéménite à la demande de la Suisse sur l'impact du changement climatique sur les personnes déplacées au Yémen a montré que près de 600 000 personnes ont été déplacées au cours des 15 dernières années à cause des torrents et des crues soudaines. Ces inondations amplifient encore le risque des maladies telles que le choléra. Par ailleurs, la destruction des infrastructures civiles et la dispersion des populations en raison du conflit armé en cours ont encore accru la vulnérabilité à ces événements climatiques. Le travail du personnel humanitaire est crucial dans ce contexte. Leur sécurité et leur accès à la population civile doivent être garantis conformément au droit international humanitaire, comme le rappelle la résolution 2730. La Suisse est très préoccupée par les limitations de l'espace civil et humanitaire par les outils qui créent un climat de peur. La détention arbitraire des civils yéménites, y compris de membres de personnel humanitaire et onusiens, est inacceptable. La Suisse condamne la prise d'assaut du bureau du HCDH à Sanaa. Nous demandons la libération immédiate de toutes les personnes détenues arbitrairement. Pénétrer sans autorisation dans un bureau de l'ONU et s'emparer par la force des documents et des biens constitue une grave violation des privilèges et immunités des Nations Unies. Monsieur le Président, Ilham Hassan termine sa lettre avec un cri pressant, un appel pour une paix durable qui préservera la liberté, la dignité, les droits et l'égalité pour tous. Nous ne pouvons que réitérer cet appel pour le Yémen et pour l'ensemble de la région. Le soutien de ce Conseil pour les efforts des Nations Unies sur le plan politique et humanitaire reste fondamental. La Suisse continuera à œuvrer dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg and OCHA Director Doughton for their briefings. Given the heightened tensions in the region, it is essential for all parties to de-escalate hostilities and exercise restraint. The regional context is not conducive to efforts to address the dire situation in Yemen, including on the humanitarian front. More than 18 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, with more than half being children. Hunger continues to be a pressing concern, with 17.6 million people suffering acute food insecurity. Cholera continues to spread throughout Yemen, with nearly 150,000 suspected cases and hundreds of deaths. Recent flooding in Yemen has impacted tens of thousands of families, damaging homes, farms, and infrastructure, and resulting in the tragic death of many civilians. We call on the Yemeni authorities to remove obstacles to the delivery of aid and allow for safe, unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need throughout Yemen. The resource gap is of similar concern. We call on the international community to support a robust response to Yemen's humanitarian crisis and urgently scale up funding for Yemen's humanitarian response plan. Ensuring that our humanitarian colleagues have the appropriate operating environment to meet the needs of all Yemenis is key. In this vein, we strongly condemn the Houthis' arrests and arbitrary detentions of United Nations personnel, civil society, and staff working for non-governmental organizations and diplomatic missions in Yemen. These arrests are unacceptable and can have far-reaching ramifications on delivery of humanitarian aid. It is vital that humanitarian personnel are able to carry out their critical work in a safe operating environment. We call for their immediate and unconditional release, While in detention, they must be held in good conditions and allowed contact with their families, colleagues, and legal counsel. We strongly condemn the Houthi storming of the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sana'a. This act is inconsistent with the privileges and immunities of the United Nations and constitutes a serious attack on the ability of the United Nations to perform its mandate. We call on the Houthis to leave the premises and return all seized assets and belongings immediately. President, the economic war that has been conducted by parties to the conflict has fragmented Yemen's economy and currency, causing inflation to rise and surging the prices of essential goods. We are encouraged by the agreement between the government of Yemen and the Houthis last month on several measures to de-escalate on the economic front. We hope this agreement can be used as a step forward towards establishing a formal nationwide ceasefire and resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led and owned political process. We welcome excuse me. We welcome the efforts of the Office of the Special Envoy and UN Women in holding a fourth consultation with representatives of diverse segments of Yemeni society. The systematic violations of women's rights to freedom of movement limit women's ability to participate in all spheres, including work, education, and access healthcare. To ensure sustainable peace, women must be able to participate fully, equally, meaningfully, and safely in political negotiations and in decision-making for Yemen's future. In conclusion, Yemen is facing a critical juncture. Last month, we witnessed a new level of escalation demonstrating the danger of a devastating region-wide conflict. The Houthis must immediately cease any military acts that could further jeopardize the safety of the millions of Yemenis who have suffered nearly a decade of war. This includes their actions against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and the unjustifiable detention of the Galaxy leader and its crew. Members of the international community are also responsible to urgently de-escalate tensions in the region and prioritize dialogue to avoid further regional escalation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statements, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Doughton for their briefings. I also want to welcome